Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our live stream program, our regular live stream program. Of course, we've just gone through 30 plus for Journalism Under Fire, and this is our regular live stream channel and time, and we're thrilled that you've all joined us today. We, of course, have one more live stream to complete 2020. That will be next Thursday, the 17th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, and that's going to feature our amazing Rule of Law panelists, which are Chuck Case, Richard Silver, Rich Moriarty, and Ambassador Vicki Huddleston. And we're going to be diving into, well, really the legacy of the Trump administration in terms of its pressures on rule of law, and then, of course, some of the issues that face the incoming Biden administration and how the Biden administration will pursue or rectify or solidify the Department of Justice, and of course, many of the legal issues that stem or that are unfolding around us right now. Of course, there's the one big issue we're all pretty interested in is around presidential pardons and what that might look like. And of course, the big question of whether President Trump may decide to preemptively pardon himself and what that might look like and how our institutions will respond to that. Just before we get to today's program, I don't need to remind you all this is the holiday season and a time of giving. And of course, we would love for you to share the gift of membership with your loved ones. I think we all know people who are as interested as we are in the world beyond. And we've made it super easy for you to give the gift of membership in CIR to your friends and loved ones. And you can do all of that on our website, which is sfcir.org/members. And we would love to have as many folks as possible. The bigger our community gets, the better it gets. Truly, the more the merrier. So on that note, please have yourself a great holiday season. And let's dive into today's conversation. So we have with us today two gentlemen. One is the author, Sean Roberts. Welcome, Sean. And I'm just going to quickly read Sean's bio. So Sean R. Roberts is an associate professor of the practice of international affairs and director of the International Development Studies program at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He is an anthropologist who studied the Uyghur people of China and Central Asia for 30 years, writing his dissertation on the Uyghurs of the China-Kazakhstan borderlands while a PhD candidate at USC. And he recently published the book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against the Muslim Minority, which we will be talking about today, of course. And then our moderator today is Ambassador Mark Asquino. Welcome, Mark. Mark, of course, is...
Happy to be here, thank you.
Welcome. Mark is on our board of directors, and he, of course, had a 37-year career in the Foreign Service. His overseas postings included assignments in Latin America, Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. Before his recent retirement from the Department of State, he was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, which is a fascinating country. And Mark, we've always talked about doing a program on Equatorial Guinea, and this is a good reminder that we need to do that at some point soon. So let me turn... Yeah. Let me remind folks to ask your questions in the Q&A. We will certainly get to that. Today's program will wrap by 11 Mountain Time, so we'll get to questions in about 45 minutes or so. And gentlemen, let me turn the proceedings over to you, and looking forward to this.
Well, thank you. And let me start off by thanking Sean for doing the program. We first met in Central Asia, in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, right after 9/11. And 9/11, really the global war on terrorism looms large in Sean's book. We worked together during that period. I was the public affairs officer. Sean was there working for USAID. I got to know Sean's wonderful Uyghur wife, Asel, who works at the State Department in the Office of Protocol. And they have a lovely little daughter, Aideen, who, when things allow for travel, I would like to meet. So Sean, let me start off by asking you about how you develop both your personal and your professional interest in the Uyghurs over the last 30 years. And having you talk a little bit about the history, the culture, the language, what really attracted you to this as your focus, not only for this book, but really for your entire career?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting story. I initially in college back in the 1980s got interested in communism at the height of the Cold War, or its kind of decline. And I went to study in Yugoslavia, and I found in Yugoslavia that Marxism and communism was not really that interesting in 1987. Nobody was really talking about it, but nationalism and Islam were both very important issues. So I decided to start studying the Muslims of the former Soviet, or at that time of the Soviet Union. And I had the opportunity to study my last year of college in 89, 90 in Uzbekistan. And a lot of American writers on Central Asia had suggested that the Muslims of the Soviet Union were going to revolt against the Soviet government, and that it was going to tear apart the country. And I got to Uzbekistan and realized that that was really not the case. There were certainly ethnic tensions similar to racial tensions you see in the US between Uzbeks and Russians, but Uzbeks were very much kind of invested in the Soviet experiment. And on my winter break, I went to China, specifically the Uyghur region. I took a very surreptitious overland route through Kazakhstan. It was at that time the Sino-Soviet border. And in the Uyghur area of China, I found that the situation was completely different, that Uyghurs were very dissatisfied with Chinese rule. And they were much more resilient in the kind of maintenance and protection of their culture. So I was fascinated with this issue, and decided to go to graduate school to study the cross-border relations, because even in 89, 90, I was finding on both sides of the border visitors, because the Soviet Union, China had just opened up relations and allowed people to visit family members across the border. I think some of the things that really interest me about the Uyghurs, they are Turkic-speaking people. Their culture is much more centered in Central Asia than in China. In fact, their language is mutually intelligible with Uzbek. They share a lot of cultural, historical commonalities with the Uzbeks. And yet they've been kind of on the outside of Central Asia. And that's been a continuing tension in their history historically. And then, one other personal, attraction to Uyghurs is they have fabulous food. That's a big part of their hospitality and kind of their social milieu, which is also very enjoyable.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you much. That really gives me a context for how you started. In the introduction to your book, Sean, you write that the Chinese state has launched a campaign to destroy Uyghur identity. And I wonder if you could talk about that to give us a bit of the historical and the political background between the Uyghurs and the Chinese, and why it is that the Chinese have engaged in what you describe as cultural genocide against the Uyghurs.
Yeah, I think one of what the term colonialism, which I use in the book, is often reserved for European domination of non-European states. From the era of colonialism, 19th, early 20th centuries. But around these same times, China was expanding its empire, and at that time it wasn't really China; it was the Qing Empire, which was Manchu-led, They conquered the Uyghur region in the mid 18th century. And that kind of began this relationship between modern China and the Uyghurs. You know, the area of Central Asia has always had different empires overlaid over it. There's been different empires from China, the Chinese side, from the south, from Iran, from the west, from Russia, and this in this instance, you know, from that point onward, the Uyghur region has very much been kind of in the Chinese domain. It was famously kind of called Chinese Turkestan in the or Eastern Turkestan in the 19th century by European travelers and scholars. And I think that it was really in the 19th century that relationship turned towards something that looks like European colonialism, an attempt to kind of integrate this region into a larger empire, and also along with that, assimilate the people to the Chinese culture. But I think that the modern period is particularly interesting in the sense that we see this very ambiguous relationship between modern China and the Uyghurs that's kind of reminiscent of colonial relationships everywhere, where there's a desire to make the Uyghurs more like the Chinese, but also at the same time an inability to accept them as equals. And it's never gotten to the point until very recently of deciding to essentially obliterate this people. And I refer to this as a motivation of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is something that's been discussed in more recent years as a way of explaining the relationships in countries where colonists have essentially settled the land. And the relationship of settler colonialism is such that the indigenous population is not exploited as much as is superfluous, and therefore must be essentially eliminated or quarantined and certainly marginalized. And that seems to be what's happening right now, and particularly since 2017 in China.
Well, if I could follow up on that a little bit, Sean, you write in the book that until the late 1990s, there was the option for the Chinese to allow a certain degree of autonomy, but also to integrate through, I guess, what Joseph Nye might say was the power of attraction. That they did a lot of investment, of development, that they tried to say, yes, you can be part of this wonderful country, China. You can have some of your traditions, religion, but this won't be forceful. And then that really changed, and of course is accentuated in 2001 after 9/11. But why did that happen? Why was that major shift in policy that you see in your book by the Chinese?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at the relationship between majority population and minority populations, especially when the minority is an indigenous population, there's various ways to deal with this. In the Soviet Union, they really welcomed the idea of the minorities having essentially limited sovereignty in the sense of these Soviet republics. And in China, they initially adopted that, but not fully. There was one very small, but I think important detail is in the Soviet Constitution, the Soviet republics had the right to secede. They were treated essentially as separate entities. And in China, in the Constitution, they had autonomous regions, but there was nothing really stipulating what that autonomy meant. There was not the right to secede. And so I think there's two reasons that you know, from that situation, there's one reason that there's been this very difficult relationship between modern China and the Uyghurs is that China has had trouble kind of acknowledging that it did colonize any areas outside. And so to this day, the Chinese state tries to portray the Uyghur region as having been part of China since time immemorial. And this comes out in official state documents as well, which is really interesting. But the other issue explicitly with 1990, you know, after the Cultural Revolution, there was a lot of reform in China, and China the state was even considering really giving more autonomy to the non-Han peoples. And so the 1980s in the Uyghur region is seen by many Uyghurs as a golden era where their culture proliferated. They were allowed to build mosques and kind of re-embrace their religious identities. There was a lot of Uyghur intellectuals creating art, you know, movies, books, all kinds of things. And it gradually from the end of the 80s started going downhill. And I think there's two watershed moments. The first is the Tiananmen Square massacre, which kind of turned the Chinese reform program away from political liberalism. And then the other one was the fall of the Soviet Union, which I think the Chinese state wrongly diagnosed as being a breaking up because of ethnic difference. You know, it was really economic issues that led to the demise of the Soviet Union, but the Chinese bureaucrats saw this as a real threat. And so there was a real attempt from 1990 onwards to police any signs of ethnic minorities taking up the call of self-determination. You know, a lot of my book covers that period from 1990 to the present and how that degraded over time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense in the context of your book. You write about the global war on terrorism, George W. Bush, as much as a narrative as it was a war itself. And I really found that concept fascinating. We were both in Tashkent when the global war on terrorism was launched. But you talk about how the Chinese government used it to portray not only Uyghur separatism, but how that merges into international jihadism and how various nascent Uyghur political movements are painted as being allied with the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda, first in Afghanistan, and then extending all the way to Syria, and how this really was an effective use of that to say we have an international terrorism problem too. And it's a fascinating line of argument, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, you know, I think it's a really important part of my book. In fact, the book began much more focused on that issue explicitly because I started writing it before the 2017 kind of degradation of relations with the Uyghurs in China and the establishment of these mass internment camps. And I was really focused on how the war on terror had impacted the Uyghurs. And, you know, it's, I think one of the core issues with the war on terror is, and I didn't realize this until I started researching it, is that there is no internationally accepted definition of what a terrorist is. And so to have a global war on, you know, a concept that is not defined immediately opens it up to exploitation, you know, and in some ways you could say that the United States had the original sin in the war on terror in terms of manipulating its use with the invasion of Iraq, which really didn't have much to do with Al-Qaeda, but was a use of that discourse about terrorism that justified an invasion that has had long running ramifications for both Iraq and the United States. And the Chinese government, almost immediately after 9/11, saw this opportunity to manipulate the war on terror, and they started lobbying internationally to have Uyghurs seen, and they initially essentially placed every Uyghur diaspora organization around the world, and they tried to portray them as being linked to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and an international terrorist threat. Unfortunately, the US initially pushed back on this, but then in the summer of 2002, they acquiesced and recognized one of these groups, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist group linked to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And although there's no smoking gun, most of the commentary at the time and retrospectively, it seems quite likely that the reason for that was really to get China's acquiescence on the US invasion of Iraq. And that has had long-lasting ramifications. In one point that I want to make about that designation of this group, the Chinese government had put out all these documents saying that all of the violent incidences in the Uyghur region during the 1990s had been the work of this grand Uyghur terrorist organization, which they said was an umbrella group of all the Uyghur organizations everywhere. And the United States decided not to recognize that, which seemed very illogical, but there was one small group of militants in Afghanistan that they recognized as being a terrorist organization linked to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And in doing so, the US attributed to that group, which in my research doesn't show that this group of individuals ever carried out any violence in China or anywhere, that they were responsible for all of the violence during the 1990s. And some of it which could have looked like political violence, some of it which was just clashes between police and civilians in the context of kind of an overactive security force, or clamping down on protests that then turned violent. And very few of them really look at all like terrorism.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to move up to 2017. It's probably the part of the Uyghur story that many people know about, their first introduction. And you talk about the Chinese government beginning to intern millions of Uyghurs in so-called re-education centers, which given pictures that we have seen in news media, look more like concentration camps. And they are indoctrinated. They are forced to speak Chinese, not to use their own language. Many of them are then sent off essentially to forced labor, sometimes in inner China, producing goods even during the pandemic. And one thing kind of stands out to me in this Trump administration, in his book, John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened, he talks about a 2019 meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping defends this, talks about really that this is something very positive. And Trump, at least according to Bolton, listens to it, says he understands that, yes, that China should continue to build these internment camps, and then finally says, yes, this is the right thing to do. So there are two parts to this. First of all, why did the Chinese move to this really draconian policy of treating the Uyghurs this way? And then second, what was the impact, do you think, of the Trump administration's reaction to what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is I'll just briefly give a little bit of background from the last question to this one, is that using this idea that Uyghurs represent an international terrorist threat allowed the Chinese government to really use draconian methods throughout the 1990s to repress any signs of Uyghur ideas of self-determination, independent religious activity, and so on. And this led to more and more violence between the police and Uyghurs. And I kind of traced that none of it, seems to have any connection to international jihadist groups, but the Chinese government very easily kind of portrays this as international terrorism, which gives it cover to be more violent in its suppression of Uyghurs. And eventually by 2013-14, some of this violence starts to look like terrorist acts. And there's a couple famous incidents, one being in the Kunming train station, where a group of Uyghurs killed a lot of Han civilians. I think that some of that violence basically led to Xi Jinping deciding to establish these internment camps and to really start a process of eliminating the Uyghur people. When he was doing that, I'm sure he was, in all the high-level officials in China were thinking about what is going to be the international response to this. And what's important about the meeting you mentioned from Bolton's book, he also mentions that he talked to Matthew Pottinger, who was also on the NSC, after that, and he said, yes, the president said something similar last year, which is even more concerning because if it was in 2018, when the information was really getting out about these mass internment camps, that could have been seen as a green light, to continue this and assume this is not going to be put down. And I think from Trump's perspective, I'm sure he was hearing, you're putting terrorists into concentration camps, and that would fit very much with I think Trump's logic of governance and his logic of security. Because certainly some of the places in the Southwest where migrants have been put in camps as well, is eerily similar.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel, actually, in terms of what we have seen here. One of the things that you say in your book that fascinated me, you're talking about the internment camps, and you say that the threat of internment actually has proven to be an extremely persuasive tool in the use of destroying Uyghur identity for those who were still outside the camps. And you speak at length about something I was totally unaware of, which is how the Chinese have used the gathering of big data and other surveillance methods to profile Uyghurs using very high-tech facial identity. And the whole thing has such an incredibly Orwellian quality about it. It's almost hard to believe, and yet you describe it in such detail. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how they have used kind of this threat of internment to make people frightened, to use their language, to be religiously observant, to do anything that identifies them with being
the camps are obviously the most headline-grabbing part of the policies. And, when people see discussion of mass internment camps that for people profiled in terms of ethnicity and religion, that immediately brings up all kinds of historical parallels. and shocking ones. And yet, I think it's only kind of a centerpiece of a network of policies that are aimed at destroying Uyghur identity as we know it, Uyghur culture as we know it. And initially it seemed that they were putting people in internment camps by quota, and local officials would be said, you must find 10% of your local population that you would characterize as extremists and put them in these camps. And they would do that. But even before they started doing that, they started developing this network of electronic surveillance that you were talking about. In fact, in 2014, I found evidence that already at that time, a Chinese electronics company was working on establishing a very sophisticated database of information about Uyghurs that would allow, somebody going through a checkpoint, you would allow whoever's manning that checkpoint to look up everything about that person. Yeah. And people would be thrown in internment camps because certain bells rang when they used this database. But beyond the database is very disturbing as it is, but the data points are also important. So they've been using facial recognition closed circuit TV cameras all throughout urban spaces that allow people to basically pinpoint where somebody was at a certain point. They also put into this database data on their internet communications, their telephone communications, and they can also put in more subjective data taken from employers, kind of profiles of loyalty. They can also see if somebody's been at the mosque or has looked at a religious website. And these all became things that would be used to decide who was an extremist and who should be put in the camp. But when you take 10% of the population and you put them in camps and you have everyone else consistently under observation, that of course creates an incredible sense of fear. I remember in 2018, I spoke to somebody who had just left the region, and they told me this was a Uyghur who had been living there the whole year, and the person's spouse had been in the United States working, and somehow the person had been able to get out with their family. But the person told me a story of just how every night she would wait to see if there would be a knock on the door, because people were taken away in the evenings to these internment camps. And the person would not talk to her relatives about what was happening, would not talk to anybody, friends, because there was a constant sense that they were completely under surveillance. And Americans who've been there since 2018 also talk about going through checkpoints and seeing when they've looked at their ID, they scan their ID, and actually they also scan your smartphone. They can immediately see where that person was that day. And this particular person told me they saw on the screen of the television, of the computer, several points in the city where she had been that day.
Wow.
Immediately.
That is amazing. Yeah.
So this is all technology that is being used all over the world in smart cities and other contexts that I think can be used very effectively in repression. And I think that's a very large concern to everybody right now about this particular issue.
Yeah, it rings certain bells about the arguments about the NSA and data collection and all of the things that we see in the US and the right to privacy and et cetera, et cetera. No, it's a fascinating parallel. Towards the end of your book, you write that the US and the Allies because of their use of the global war on terror, have little authority to criticize China, given what we all know, particularly about the US, or reprehensible actions using GWAT as a justification. And I wonder, as you look at this new Biden administration coming in, and we do have now a national security team, a number of these people were also in previous administrations, in the Obama administration. What credibility will they have to take a new tact, different from the Trump administration, in speaking out against what China is doing to the Uyghurs?
I think the Biden administration can be much more effective, but it is going to be a difficult road. I was just asked to write something about this, and I think one of the difficulties is Biden's foreign policy suggests that he would like to see the U.S. lead the world in human rights by example. And this entails reversing a lot of the kind of democratic backsliding in human rights in the U.S. But I argue it may also require trying to end the war on terror and figuring out how to get out of a quagmire that we've kind of placed ourselves in, and has seemed to have lost its way. And I think this is particularly important because one of the things the Biden administration can certainly do that would be more effective than the Trump administration is it can establish a coalition of states that could put pressure on China. And right now we're seeing coalition of Western states essentially putting pressure on China, but China does not really respond to that because it has such strong soft power in the developing world now. And I think one group of states that should be particularly concerned about what's happening in the Uyghur region are Muslim majority states, where they see the Chinese government essentially forcibly dismantling religion among the Uyghurs, forcing Uyghurs to eat pork and all kinds of things that are essentially humiliating to them and the Islamic faith. And thus far, the Muslim world has not really responded to this. But I think it's in part because the U.S. has lost a lot of credibility, and the Chinese government is responding to Western criticism, saying, "Well, look what the West did in the war on terror." We're much more humane than using drones on civilian populations. We're re-educating these people, trying to get them into factories. And so I think to really get a stronger response from the Muslim world, besides the fact that I think it's the right thing to do, it would be really important for the Biden administration to kind of find a way out of the quagmire of the war on terror.
That's fascinating. It really is. In the conclusion of your book, Sean, you indicate that there are broader implications that you see for what has been the dehumanization of the Uyghurs, the attacks on their culture, on their religion, on their ethnicity, and you see what you describe as a certain malaise about human rights, about the protection of minority rights. You note what has happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar, and there are certainly other examples. It's a somewhat pessimistic note to the book, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and whether you see this as really the wave of the future because what the Chinese have done, or whether there is a way, kind of coming back to what you've just said, to push against it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is, I think everything is not lost in terms of the ideal of a world-based, a rights-based world order, which is we've tried since World War II to really create with the UN the ideal of human rights and all kinds of other rights that we want to see as universal, that can be protected by the international community and prevent something like World War II happening again. And I think we are on kind of a precipice of that. We see it, I mean, it's interesting to look at the different responses. A lot of people in international affairs are talking about the decline of American hegemony. The Obama administration approached that by trying to build coalitions, and the Biden administration is saying the same thing it wants to do. It wants to. It doesn't want to take a tactic where it's saying the U.S. is the leader of the world. It wants to say the democracies of the world need to stand up to these issues. And I think the Trump administration took us quite a ways backwards in that, because the Trump administration's response was to remove ourselves from international institutions, in the UN in particular. And in the interim, the Chinese government has stepped in to really take more and more prominent positions in the UN, and so has Russia. And they both, I think their motivations are in large to push back against this idea of a rights-based, universal rights-based world order, and to say, rights are situational. They're there's sovereignty is more important, and we should all stay out of each other's affairs and just make money together. And I think that is a very ominous direction if that continues. So I think I do see the Biden administration, and I appreciate their foreign policy goals, which really focus probably on a more idealist foreign policy than any administration probably in my lifetime. And we'll see if they're able to realize this, but I have hopes.
Yeah, well, we're nearing the end of the formal part of this, and let me end on something optimistic that I found in your book. You talk about the resilience of Uyghur culture. You talk about how they have formed diaspora communities, how those diaspora communities are providing support, and you sort of look perhaps to a future of the Uyghur homeland that will not be overwhelmed or destroyed by the Han Chinese. And so I wonder, just in a couple of minutes, if you might talk about that more hopeful view of the future for the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah, I think that given the scale of what's happening, it would be very difficult for the Chinese state to just kind of unilaterally reverse policies under the present leadership. I mean, I think that in some ways, there's some autocratic regimes can reverse very bad policies by blaming local governments.
Yeah.
And saying, well, I was not aware of this, the leader of the state can say. And Xi Jinping has essentially gone all in terms of this policy. Yeah. And so the one way I could see there being a reversal is, if there was a decision among other powerful people in China that this was not in the interests of the Chinese state, which I don't think it is, that they would remove Xi Jinping and essentially blame him for all these excesses and try to establish a different relationship with Uyghurs. And I think that would be welcome. And I think it's important to note that this is different than the Cultural Revolution in China or the Stalinist purges in the Soviet Union, because in those instances, all ethnic groups suffered. And so when they ended, people were able to get on with their lives and forget about what had happened, because everybody shared the same stories. These ones are all ethnically profiled. which I think creates a much more difficult exit point, but I do think there is a possible exit point.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you. Thanks a lot. Sandy, I think we have reached our 45-minute point, and I also see that there are questions that we have. So why don't I turn it over to you in terms of calling on some of the members of the public, of our audience, to ask some questions.
Sure. There's a couple questions here, Sean, that are kind of probing the distinction or similarity between the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. Can you comment on that and maybe outline some of the differences and similarities?
So I think in the big picture, there's more similarities than differences, which gets to some of the things we talked about at the beginning of our discussion in terms of China's relationship with ethnic cultural difference. And, you know, and in particular, as it has to do with populations that have homelands within China, you know, essentially indigenous people within China who are not recognized as indigenous. So for a long time, the People's Republic of China has had the same sort of repression of any ideas of self-determination from the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. I think the big difference that we do see, it does relate to the war on terror, and the decision that I think the Chinese government made that it could get away with being more repressive with the Uyghurs because they had the cover of this idea of international terrorism. And, you know, there's some signs that what's happening in Tibet right now, that they may be replicating some of the things from the Uyghur region in terms of control. They're certainly in implementing a lot of the same electronic surveillance. And there's some talk about re-education camps. I haven't seen it definitely reaffirmed yet. But there's one other difference, I guess, that's important, is that the Tibetans are a smaller population. And as nomadic peoples, they're a little bit more dispersed. And so I think the Chinese government's found it easier to control any kind of dissent in Tibet than in the Uyghur region.
And I remember well, you know, Richard Gere and other celebrities, you know, arguing on behalf of the Tibetans. And a question here from Barbara Chatterjee, building on that, you know, what options do we have as individuals and of course as governments to intervene on behalf of the Uyghurs? You know, boycotts were used, of course, memorably around the Tibetan campaign. Are there similar levers that we individually or as a government might pull?
Yeah, I think so. One of the aspects which we didn't get into too deeply is that there has been a movement towards putting a lot of the Uyghurs in essentially coerced, segregated residential labor in factories. And a lot of the goods being produced in these factories, well, one thing is they've distributed that throughout China, which is really a major problem, because to try to keep any product with Uyghur forced labor in the supply chain out of the country, which is something the US is trying to do, is going to require virtually a boycott of China. And you know, it may have to come to that. I mean, I think that at the very least, looking at boycotting some of the electronic companies that are involved in this mass surveillance. And this is something that, you know, also becomes very complicated because a lot of those companies use computer chips from American companies. And right now there's a bill in Congress. It passed the House and it's up for vote in the Senate. And there's it's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And Apple and Nike and a lot of major corporations are lobbying heavily against it because they know that they have things in their supply chain that have been tainted by this. But the last point I'll make is, well, I'll make two quick points. One is, I think about the effort to boycott or to divest from South Africa. I could see a major opportunity here. I think the levers on China are mostly economic. And, there's a lot of large funds, pension funds, university endowments that are invested in particular in Chinese tech stock. And that is a way to really put pressure on China. And the last point is there are some Uyghur organizations. I encourage everyone to look up the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which is a fantastic organization that's based in the US. It has Uyghurs and non-Uyghurs working for it. And it's a great place to donate to during the holiday season.
So let's talk about migration a little bit. There's a couple questions here. One is about, mainland Chinese moving to sort of essentially minimize or dilute indigenous influences in the region. And secondly, are there Uyghurs migrating in greater numbers legally or illegally, across international borders?
So in terms of the first question, absolutely, that it's been something that's been happening since the founding of the People's Republic of China. There's been, I guess, in the first maybe 30 years of communist China's rule in the region, the share of Han inhabitants there went from 5% to 40%. So it was very significant. But I think that what's important is the southern area of the Uyghur region remained almost all Uyghur. And that seems to be the area that they're trying to clear out now. That's where the majority of Uyghurs live. They're being displaced, put in factories, internment centers. There's also the destruction of Uyghur villages happening and an opportunity for Han to move there. And there's incentives to move there. There's not a forced movement of Han to the region, but there's incentives. And there's a lot of reason to do so as well, because one of the key issues is this region is very strategic in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is the entry point for everything, entry exit point, everything going west and southwest from China in that initiative, which of course is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative. And then the other point about Uyghurs leaving, so there were mass exoduses after 2009, when there was basically ethnic riots took place in the region, and the Uyghurs were blamed for it, even though there was violence on both sides. And thousands of Uyghurs fled at that time, both illegally and legally. But my sense is right now there's very, very few who are able to leave. And I think it's in part a security issue for the Chinese state, because they don't want people going out and telling their stories. And some of the people who have gotten out have gotten to the former Soviet Union, and that's partially been because they had dual citizenship either in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, and they were able to get out for that reason.
Great question here from Bob Helmholtz. He says, does the increased allowable reproduction rate in China also apply to the Uyghurs, or are they, more or less moved or exempt from that due to China's interest in them not having a higher reproductive rate?
It does, but what's interesting is that the old policy was that ethnic minorities were allowed 2 children, whereas Han were allowed 1. So now they've kind of gotten that kind of affirmative action part of it out of it. But there is a lot of evidence that rather than having legal limits, what the Chinese government's doing is there's forced sterilization campaigns, and there's been a lot of evidence coming out that people who are put in these camps, women who are put in these camps are being sterilized, and there's other just people outside the camps when they go to a gynecologist are being sterilized. So there certainly seems to be an attempt to limit the population through more kind of physician means than through legal means.
Oof, that's scary. Question here from Tom Johnson. I'm not sure I understand it properly, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Given the number of characters in the Chinese language, what do the characters look like that come up with a search query of a Chinese data set?
I am not really sure. I mean, one thing that I can mention is that the Uyghur language doesn't use the Chinese characters. It uses Arabic script. And my own linguistic background is Uyghur, Uzbek, and Russian rather than Chinese. But I will ask some of my colleagues about that specific question, see if I can come up with anything.
Super. Well, why don't we conclude with a couple of brighter conversations about Uyghur culture. There's a great question here from Alice Jennings. You mentioned the great food of the Uyghurs. Can you walk us a little bit into the cultural life of the Uyghurs via food and maybe some of their traditions?
Sure. And I think this is particularly important because one of the resilience of the Uyghur people, resilient characteristics, is that I think because they've long been a people without any kind of state representation, they're extremely self-organizing. They establish all kinds of informal networks. And what I found is that Uyghurs who leave their homeland immediately establish communities. And so, you will find, wherever you find Uyghurs, you will find probably lots of Uyghurs. And so in Northern Virginia, for example, we have a strong Uyghur community that has, cultural centers, schools, and all kinds of things, support networks. And a lot of that support is around traditional life cycle celebrations, circumcisions, births, weddings, funerals, all of these things. And these are things the Chinese state is starting to target as signs of extremism, but they really don't have any, they have some religious elements, but it's much more the cultural elements that are important to the people. And of course, at the center of all those kinds of celebrations are food. And I think what I would recommend to anybody who has an opportunity to eat Uyghur food is to try lagman. This is kind of, I think a lot of cultures have the dish that can be made lots of different ways. It's like I guess maybe like the Uyghur burrito. And its base is hand-pulled noodles, and then on top of that is a fabulous stir fry, usually of lamb, but it can be made of vegetables. It can be made with other meats, and it tends to be somewhat spicy, and it's fantastic. And when I used to travel in the Uyghur region, I would eat it every single day, and I would find that no two times did I eat the same kind of lagman. It was always in variants. And I don't know about Santa Fe, but in Washington, the Washington, D.C. area, we have probably 4 or 5 new Uyghur restaurants that have opened up over the last 3 years.
Wow, that sounds good. That suddenly made me hungry. But Sean Roberts, thank you so much for taking the time and walking us through this fascinating set of issues. Again, his book I put in the chat window, but it's The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against Xinjiang's Muslims. And there's an Amazon link there as well. Thank you, Mark. There it is. That's a great book and an extremely important issue. So Sean, thank you so much. Have a great holiday season.
Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you, Sean. Regards to Estelle, and have wonderful holidays, and really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, Mark. And bye, everybody. Stay safe out there and let it snow.